Okay, welcome to this session, Charity Evaluation and its Future. The session aims to give an up-to-date overview of the charity evaluation field, share the different approaches of the three largest EA-inspired public evaluators, and discuss approaches, the current state and future of the field. Sjir from Given What We Can will give an introduction and overview, after which Olivia from GiveWell, Rosie from Founders Pledge, and Stien from Charity Evaluators will give a short presentation on the approaches of each of their organizations. The second half of the session will consist of a panel discussion and Q&A on issues ranging from common misconceptions about charity evaluation, the role of grant-making funds versus charity recommendations, and the most pressing gaps in the field. This session will be most relevant for donors who would like to make better informed decisions about their giving, people who are considering doing work in charity evaluation or fundraising, and people with a general interest in effective giving. So first we have Sjir. Sjir leads the research team at Given What We Can and is involved in international coordination efforts in effective giving. Prior to joining Given What We Can, he was a senior researcher at Founders Pledge, covering topics ranging from women's empowerment to subjective well-being to the optimal timing of giving. Sjir is also a co-founder and board member of EA Netherlands and founding member of the management committee of the Patient Philanthropy Fund. As a reminder, for the panel at the end, you can submit questions via the Swapcard app. Simply open this session and submit questions, and Sjir will pick some to ask later on. Okay, please welcome Sjir.
Oh, thanks a lot, Ollie. Hi, everyone. Super excited to have you all here, and especially to be sharing this session with these three great organizations, GiveWell, ACE, and Founders Pledge. As Ollie said, I'll be giving you first a quick overview of the charity evaluation field, and then about our role, Given What We Can in that field. And then I'll hand over to my three esteemed co-speakers to tell a bit more about their evaluators and their approach. And after that, we'll go into a discussion, really a free-flow discussion about what all of these evaluators do and their approach and the broader field. So I'll start right away with an introduction to this broader charity evaluation field. And I'll talk a bit about the different types of organizations in this field, about what they are and what they do, and particularly also why Given What We Can is doing this new project of evaluating the evaluators, why we think that's important. So to start with, what does the field consist of? Currently, we have, I think one way of modeling it is two types of organizations. So we have charity evaluators, the ones you're probably familiar with, like GiveWell. And they make public charity recommendations and often also host these publicly accessible grant-making funds. They're not the only organizations active, though, and there's some that you might have heard of that also have an influence on kind of public recommendations being made. So, for example, there's grant-makers and advisors, like Open Philanthropy, that themselves host either grant-making funds or advise other organizations on their recommendations. So there's these two types of categories that are important in this broader evaluation field. And I'll start by saying a bit more about these evaluators. So first, the evaluators. I'll divide them into two groups because it's kind of like the three large traditional kind of more established evaluators, which are all here, and there's also a few smaller ones. So the larger, and a large is really between brackets here, because these are the only organizations that have more than 3 full-time researchers working on the actual evaluation all the time. And it tells you something about how small this field still is, how young this field still is, and how much potential for growth there still is. So these are GiveWell, Animal Charity Evaluators, and Founders Pledge, and they're all here, and they'll all say something about their own approach later, so I'm not going to say much about them, except that GiveWell has been around for the longest and also by far the largest of these three, but the others have also grown to and have been making charity recommendations for many years. But they'll all say a lot more about themselves, so I'll stop there. Then there's these smaller, kind of often new evaluators that are kind of starting to rise. And that's, I think, very exciting. We see more diversity in the evaluation field. These are all really small, so they all have less than 3 full-time staff working really on evaluations and grant-making. There's different types. So you have the kind of cause-specific or worldview-specific evaluators like Happy Alive Institute and Giving Green. You have the broader evaluators like The Life You Can Save and So Give, and you have the geography-specific evaluators like Joy Ben in Brazil and Charity Box in China. And they're all kind of new models and all being tried out, and they're also still kind of have to establish themselves. So They aren't being used as much yet by other organizations for the recommendations, but they're trying things out and kind of setting things up. So really excited to see where that goes. Like I said, there's also a few other types of organizations which are relevant to the public charity evaluation field. And these are a few grant makers and advisors. There's about 5 that I know of right now. And these are the ones that themselves host grant-making funds, such as EA Funds and Center on Long-Term Risk. And then there's also a few that advise other organizations on their grant-making, on their funds, such as Open Philanthropy and Longview Philanthropy and Focus Philanthropy. And so, for example, Given What We Can, the organization I work for, we host a long-termism fund which is managed by Longview. That's one example of this, and this is true for many other fundraising type organizations. So this is the whole field, as far as I know. And please tell me if you know of any organization that I haven't covered. And it's a really small field. I want to emphasize that once more. In total, there's only a couple of dozen people really full-time working on charity evaluation and recommendations. So we're really in early stages, and there's a lot to be done. But it's also growing, and I think it's super exciting to see that we have all these new evaluators, this new field starting up. What's also growing, and that's also, I think, exciting, is the fundraising side of effective giving. So there's more than 20 fundraising organizations now that try to fundraise for effective charities. And what's important to note is that these fundraising organizations, such as Given What We Can itself, but also national fundraising organizations, so for example, you have Effective Spenden in Germany, or Ayuda Efectiva in Spain. You have target group specific fundraising organizations, such as High Impact Athletes, who focus on athletes. There's all these types of fundraising organizations coming up, and they rely on the recommendations from these evaluators that we've just talked about. And that's important because these fundraising organizations, they're also quite small, and they don't have their own research capacity to really evaluate which evaluators to work with. And that means that currently they have to go based on public reputation and kind of quick quality checks because they don't have their own researchers who can look into this stuff. And that wasn't a problem before, perhaps because before you only had a few evaluators, the large ones mainly. You only had very few fundraising organizations. So it was mostly these evaluators themselves, which are very transparent about their findings, sharing their findings with the broader public. So there wasn't really much of an issue, as there is maybe now, because now you have many more evaluators coming up. You have many more fundraising organizations, so the stakes are much higher. And how do you choose as an evaluator or as a donor between all these possible options? And how do we avoid having a field where any kind of organization can just stand up and say, hey, we're an EA evaluator, please use our recommendations? How do you distinguish between all these? Well, for that reason, to kind of solve or at least make progress on that problem, Given What We Can is launching this Evaluating the Evaluators project. I'll tell you a little bit more about that. So the why, the what, and the how of that project, which I'm really excited about, and it's also really challenging, but I think it needs to be done. So why? Well, evaluator choice matters. And it matters for the same reason that charity choice matters. We all probably know about the big differences between different charities in terms of their cost effectiveness. And the evaluator you choose to follow kind of determines which charities you in the end pick. So for the same reason, it matters that we have high quality evaluations and that we choose the right evaluators given our worldview and values. It also isn't straightforward. It just requires a lot of time and expertise to do good charity evaluation. It's not a straightforward thing to do for any individual or even for a fundraising organization. And thirdly, incentives aren't really there by themselves. So if you're an evaluator and you really believe in the recommendations you found, you have an incentive to promote them. You want people to give to these charities that you believe in. So you're going to use marketing. You're going to try to figure out how you get money to these charities. And that isn't really an incentive for you to keep improving your methodology. There's more of an incentive to do good marketing, like in the kind of traditional charity sector in some ways. So there isn't automatically something that's going to go well there. And in some ways, we've just been very lucky that GiveWell has set such a high standard and such a kind of high bar for transparency and rigor and truthfulness in their evaluations. I can't even themselves honest. But we can't rely on those kinds of like individual initiatives of organizations to keep the field going. We need to have this infrastructure to kind of set the right incentives in this space, I think. So what are we going to do? We're going to try to provide basically two things. So one is providing an overview of the charity evaluation field, like I just did, but then a lot more extensive, and what the different approaches are that different evaluators take. Their worldview, their values, the assumptions that go into their evaluation. So the donors and fundraising organizations can choose based on knowing what their real approaches are. This is distinct to some extent from doing a quality check on what we think, how good their methodology is in identifying the best charities given those assumptions. We want to do both, though in this first year, we'll likely focus a lot more on this providing an overview thing and really trying to make the field more transparent. And the reason there is we want to be really cautious. We want to be cautious not to kind of overclaim. We are a really small research team that gives what we can. We're not going to come out there and just say like, oh, we think these are good and these are bad, and kind of have the negative impacts of that. So also important to note here is that we, like I just said, we're really thinking about building a field here. We're not thinking about picking winners or losers or something. We're trying to build the charity value where the field help it grow. So we'll be working with evaluators rather than kind of adversarial to evaluators to kind of improve the field as a whole. And that means also being a bit more cautious in the kind of statements you make. At the end of the day, though, of course, given what we can has to choose which evaluators it presents on its website, and so do all the other fundraising organizations. So we'll have to make choices, and this will be a really challenging part of this project. How do we do it? Well, there's an important thing there about the caution. We will check, what we'll likely do is check against a list of questions and criteria. And so it won't be a rating framework. We won't have, say, Animal Charity is an 8 and GiveWell is a 9 or something like that. That's not going to work. That's probably going to be misleading in many ways. It's not the goal to, again, pick winners or losers. The goal is to make things transparent. And so we'll likely be sharing lots of considerations as transparently as we can with everyone who wants to read about it. So that's the challenge we face. We think it's a very challenging project, but also that it needs doing. And welcome any feedback from all of you also at this conference. Please come also to office hours and other places to give us feedback on these ideas. I've taken a lot of time. One of the goals of this project and this session is to make the field more transparent, and that's why I'm so happy that we're joined here by the three most established and biggest evaluators there are. So I'm going to hand over to them to tell a bit more about their evaluators and their approach. And I'll start by the one you probably all know of, definitely, is GiveWell. And I'm going to introduce Olivia. Let's see. All right, Olivia Larsen. Olivia Larsen is a philanthropy advisor at GiveWell, where she works with donors to help them achieve their philanthropic goals. She's been on both the research and outreach teams during her time at GiveWell, and she holds an MBA from Yale University and a bachelor's degree from Williams College. Please give a hand for Olivia.
Thank you so much, Sjir, and thank you everyone for being here and talking a little bit about some of the things that we're excited about in the charity evaluation field and space. So most people here are probably already familiar with GiveWell and our top charities. Some quick, fast facts. GiveWell was founded in 2007. We do research into really cost-effective giving opportunities we find in global health and development. We moved $600 million last year to our recommended charities and other giving opportunities, and we have around 60 employees, 30 of whom are on our research team. So these are GiveWell's top charities. This is the product you're probably most familiar with within GiveWell. We have 4 top charities working in malaria control and prevention, vitamin A supplementation, and incentives for childhood vaccination that we think represent really stellar giving opportunities for donors who want to have a really high impact with a very high level of confidence. We also have a top charities fund where anyone who wants to can contribute either to any of our top charities individually or toward our top charities fund, which we allocate quarterly to the top charity or top charities that we think could use funds most effectively at that time. What you might not be as familiar with is GiveWell's work and our grant making outside of our top charities. So in 2022, we allocated over $75 million to non-top charity giving opportunities. These types of giving opportunities could be earlier stage charities that we want to support as they scale up and consider whether they could be future top charities. It could be opportunities to fund research so that GiveWell can make better funding decisions later. Or it could just be an opportunity that seems really cost effective, even if we don't think that it will persist as a future giving opportunity. Some recent highlights from our All Grants Fund include a grant we made to the Clinton Health Access Initiative for them to create a team to work on identifying interventions that could be really cost effective, but that don't currently have a clear implementer, testing, scoping, and scaling those programs as things that GiveWell could potentially fund in the future through CHI. Another highlight is a recent grant that we made to researchers at University College of London to run a randomized control trial on the impacts of how preventative anti-malarial medication might change its effectiveness when paired with the RTSS malaria vaccine that's being rolled out in some areas now. So we have a really high bar for making grants and adding top charities. And as you can see from some of these rough statistics, we also have a very high bar for supporting organizations through our All Grants Fund. And the way that GiveWell compares between our top charities and our all grants in deciding how to prioritize our grant making is through a funding bar. So we use cost effectiveness analysis to analyze everything and put everything in terms of how much more cost effective they are than unconditional cash transfers like those distributed by GiveDirectly. The reason we use cash transfers as our funding bar is that it's a really obvious intervention that is cost effective, and so it's kind of a baseline. We wouldn't want to support anything that wasn't at least significantly more cost effective than GiveDirectly, because otherwise GiveDirectly would be a better option. So our current bar for funding is 10 times as cost effective as cash transfers. And that's a high bar. It's set that high because we're funding constrained. So we think that the funding opportunities we'll see above 10x cash will about equal the funds that we have available to allocate. If we find more opportunities above 10x than we expect to, we'll raise our bar so that we're funding the most cost effective things first. So I talk a lot about cost effectiveness, and we do a lot at EA Global and things like that. So I want to get a little bit more concrete in sharing what GiveWell means when we talk about cost effectiveness. So sorry, this is a bit of a bear of a slide, but I'll talk through most of it. But when GiveWell is considering a funding opportunity, we want to think about a particular charity implementing a particular intervention in a particular area. So in this case, it would be evaluating the Against Malaria Foundation distributing insecticide-treated malaria nets in Guinea. So we talked to the Against Malaria Foundation to try and understand what's the all-in cost of purchasing and delivering a net, including in-kind donations and funds covered by other actors. Then we look at the evidence from monitoring from the Against Malaria Foundation to see historically how often the nets that they distribute are actually in use. This monitoring information is from studies which have methodologies like people knocking on doors months after the distribution to go look at sleeping spaces and see if nets are being hung over those sleeping spaces. So from there, we also look at the evidence from randomized control trials to see how many people a net usually covers. So from there, we have how many people will sleep under a particular, under a cohort of malaria nets. And then we need to understand what's the all-cause mortality rate in these populations. This is because the evidence in the randomized control trials that we rely on to make our recommendations measure the impact of malaria nets on all-cause mortality. So we find information about the baseline all-cause mortality rate through a variety of methods, including, talking to the governments and other places that collect this type of data. And so then once we know the expected kind of mortality rate in this cohort of people that are covered by these particular nets, we want to see how many lives we'd expect these nets to save. So we've synthesized 23 academic studies that connect malaria net distributions to reductions in mortality rates. And when we synthesize this information, we're not just taking the top line evidence from the RCTs or from the meta-analyses. We're really considering how we think these studies will be, how their findings will be applicable today. So we synthesize and we often adjust downward based on internal validity and external validity, such as how baseline malaria rates have changed in these places from when the studies were implemented, and how insecticide resistance, for example, has increased. Then after we have that, we want to also think about GiveWell's impact on other funders. We think us funding this particular distribution reduces the likelihood that another funder will fund this distribution. So we kind of roughly model that we think that this will reduce our impact by around 30%. And so that's kind of all the inputs, and there's more as well, that help us determine a realistic cost effectiveness analysis for how much it costs to save a life. Now, we're not certain of these impacts, of these inputs in our cost effectiveness analysis. They all involve subjective assessments and judgment calls. But we want to explicitly model things as much as we can and put concrete numbers on the models we're using, because A, it allows us to organize our thinking and be sure that we're justifying the things that we make decisions off of. And B, being explicit about the figures we're using, even when they're subjective, allows others to review our work and offer their critiques, which can improve our grant making. So I wanted to focus most of this talk on cost effectiveness because it's the biggest factor in GiveWell's grant making decisions and a big part of what makes GiveWell GiveWell. I'm happy to go into anything else that people are excited about in the Q&A. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Olivia. All right, now it's my honor to introduce Stien. Stien van der Ploeg, who is the new Executive Director of Animal Charity Evaluators. Just prior to joining ACE, they supported several animal advocacy organizations, including Wild Animal Initiative. The last 20 years, they worked for various causes, including many non-EA ones, in multiple countries, applying their leadership, fundraising, and strategic thinking skills. They appreciate a good conversation as much as logically organized spreadsheet. Nice. Stien van der Ploeg, everyone.
Thank you, Sjir. Thank you, Olivia, too. You'll probably know that this is an exception. Most chickens are born without parents. They live in squalor with pain and die terrible deaths. So my donations, your donations, should go where they help the most to save, spare, and improve lives. A brief glance at our theory of change. In the back, you probably can't read this, but it will show you that our two programs are charity evaluations and grant making. Our evaluations lead to recommendations for donors, and our reviews help charities to better understand the work and the field that they're in. And then we give grants to our recommended charities. Together, these grants and evaluations hopefully lead to a stronger animal advocacy movement, and that movement should then lead to more individuals being able to experience well-being faster. So in 2022, we looked at 635 charities. Of those, we did a comprehensive review of about 12. And of those, we recommended 1 new top charity and 4 new standout charities. And in total, we now recommend 15 charities. We have a bunch of different criteria, and we've updated those this year for the upcoming evaluation. And each of these are based on various qualitative and quantitative factors. The first one is approach, so how promising the charities' programs are. And for that, we look at the interventions, in which region those are executed, and towards which outcomes and for which animals. Then we want to know how cost-effective these programs are implemented. We look at room for more funding. And then in addition, we also want to know if there are potentially any serious substantial management issues that could negatively impact how a charity delivers its results and how stable they are. Don't hold me to these names. Like I said, we have just updated these criteria, so check out the forum in the upcoming weeks for the final phrasing of them. And each of these criteria, you should know, are also weighted differently. A lot more goes into this, so that's what office hours are for, and Max, our researcher, is also here. Then a couple of the peculiarities of evaluating animal charities. First, funding. Around 200 million goes towards farmed animal welfare per year, and that is global, so very, very little. Then, unlike human charities, we don't deal with just one species, but with very many of who each experience life in very different ways, who live in different circumstances, who speak languages that we don't understand, and in general, we just know very little about them. And that adds a lot of uncertainty. Then right now, it also seems that various interventions depend on each other to a degree for success. So that means that to build an anti-speciesist society is a little bit like baking a cake. You need a lot more flour, but fat and sugar are also necessary. I've been told. I don't actually bake. And so right now there are, it seems that corporate campaigns work really well, but that doesn't mean that alternative proteins or vegan outreach aren't also important. There is a caveat. Some ingredients will probably completely mess up your cake, and there are also some interventions that might actually do more harm than good. Context matters a lot too. What works for chickens here in England on mega farms, that same approach is not going to work to protect pigs who are raised in skyscraper factories in China. And then lastly, there is just also in general a lot of empirical data that we don't have. So that makes quantifying lives saved per dollar practically impossible. So to deal with all of those unknowns, we also have our movement grants program that should help build a more pluralistic and resilient movement. And with that program, we fund, let's say, programs and projects in neglected regions and serving neglected animals, or that try out new novel programs. Then a little bit about the space in which we operate. You'll know that we are born out of EA, but because our comparatively tiny budget, it seems that for us it makes more sense to really focus on our recommendation role over our grant-making role. So that means that we need to reach a wider audience. So we're going to test that this year. And you'll see the results of that in that our work actually becomes much more rigorous, while at the same time our messaging will probably simplify so that we can also communicate with, let's say, people who eat bacon but do care about how animals are treated outside of our community. And so that they might also start including farmed and wild animals in their moral circle.
Thank you very much, Stien. Okay. Let's see. Last but not least, my previous colleague, Rosie Battle. Rosie is an applied researcher at Founders Pledge and a co-manager of their Global Health and Development Fund. Her background is in biological research. She has a PhD in biopsychology from the University of Michigan and a master's in human evolutionary biology from Harvard University. My pleasure to introduce to you Rosie Battle.
Hi everyone, thank you, Sjir. I'm excited to chat to you about charity evaluation, nerd out about valuation a little bit, and talk about Founders Pledge. So we were launched back in 2015 by David Goldberg with the aim of enabling entrepreneurs to do the most good possible with their philanthropic giving. So we're trying to kind of be like a one-stop shop almost for busy entrepreneurs. We have a research team, advisory, we have community events, and we have a whole infrastructure set up so that entrepreneurs can give as easily and effectively as possible. So our basic model is that we have about 1,800 members, mainly tech entrepreneurs, and they sign up by taking this pledge that they're going to give a certain percentage of their proceeds to charity. When they're all set to donate, our top recommendation is normally that they give to one of our funds or they can give directly to one of our recommended charities. And this is a non-exhaustive list of some of the charities that we recommend. And then zooming in on our research, so the aim for our research team is to be able to source those charity recommendations by doing evaluations, and also to decide where to spend that fund money. So our research director, that's Matt, he's up on top. Then we've got 7 other full-time researchers. Some of us specialize in particular areas, and there's a couple of us who do work a little bit in global health and development, and a little bit in the long-termism global catastrophic risk space. Our kind of odd one out at the moment is animal welfare, where we defer to what other evaluators, such as ACE, tell us. And each of these different worldviews has its own fund, and we have different charity recommendations within each area. So just to give you a bit of a sense, in the long-termism global catastrophic risk space, we've funded people like Professor Tetlock, the Center for Human Compatible AI, the biological arm of Nuclear Threat Initiative, and Berkeley Risk and Security Lab. Global health and development, we have a bunch of classic GiveWellian recommendations like AMF, new incentives, and so on. We also support some younger organizations we think are incredibly promising, like Savita, Family Empowerment Media, and sometimes research initiatives like Everything Against Everything, which is like a drug discovery research program. Then climate, we funded people like the Clean Air Task Force, Terra Praxis, and Carbon 180, so all doing innovative new things to try and improve climate. And then animal welfare, we supported people like the Humane League, Good Food Institute. So what does our research process actually look like? Well, we start off with our prioritization. So we have a big pipeline with tons of ideas. Then we use our ITN sieve to sieve out the best ones. And those move to a cause area investigation, when we're looking in a bit more depth to see, is it really promising? And in this space, what are the most promising interventions? If it still looks good, then we're going to find charities doing those interventions and evaluate them in some depth. So we're going to do things like cost-effective analysis. We're going to interview a bunch of experts, as long as the charity themselves, examine their room for funding, and so on. Then finally, once we've got that evaluation, we do a ton of red teaming. So in a nice way, we try and poke holes in it. We check if that rating is robust, and so on. So some of our key tenets are risk neutrality. We're happy to make strategic bets when we think it's a good idea. Having the ability to respond quickly. And in areas with a higher amount of uncertainty, things like long-termism and climate, we often use impact multipliers. So thinking about the key characteristics that mean that one funding opportunity is likely to be more cost-effective than another. So maybe for like something, we might think that leveraging government spending is more impactful than funding intervention directly, for example. And when there's a lot of uncertainty, we might lean towards using that impact multiplier approach over a more traditional cost-effectiveness analysis. Okay, so how are we actually doing? So our estimated pledge value, this is from all our members who've pledged, is nearly 10 billion. This is obviously incredibly exciting, but in the interest of full transparency, I want to give a few caveats. First, it's just difficult to value companies. We feel good that we have quite a diversified base, right, with like over 1,800 members, but there's some inherent uncertainty to do with valuing each of those. Second, we do expect some of that money to go to charities which we don't explicitly recommend. In 2022, this is about 64%, but this is lowered from our inception, and we're exploring ways to reduce that further. Finally, I just want to note that our bar for recommending a charity is 1 times give directly, so it has to be at least as good as give directly. But in reality, most of our charities, and in particular our funds, significantly exceed that. And then beyond pledge value, you can also look at the total money we've sent to our recommended charities. At the moment, that's about 69 million. And the graph on your right, you can see how that's increased year on year. Okay, so just quickly, some like common questions. First, is your research member-led? Short version of this is no. We use like that ITN framework. Second, what is your place in the GHD landscape? There are other great organizations here like GiveWell and so on. I would like to emphasize our risk neutrality. We can make strategic bets when we want to and test out things that are maybe a bit tricky to test with lots of RCTs, which is kind of enabled by having a different donor base, right? We have tech entrepreneurs who are used to thinking about risk in that kind of way. And finally, I also think that a big part of our role should be to catalyze growth for organizations who maybe aren't at the kind of scale yet to absorb, GiveWell, Gates funding, et cetera, but we think we can propel them up as quickly as possible if they're very promising to get to that kind of scale. Then just quickly, how do our moral weights work? We use a mix of recipient, researcher, donor estimates alongside some empirical data to get a hold of these. And we cover a lot of different measures within that, which gives us a lot of flexibility using data sources and so on. Cool, that's it from me, but obviously very happy to answer any questions on this further. Thank you.
I'd like to now invite everyone on the stage. We're going to have a discussion. We're going to try to have a kind of free-flow discussion. Let's see where's the clicker. Thank you. Thanks. All right. Here we go. So I certainly have a lot of questions. I hope you do as well. If you do, please put them in the Swapcard app, and then I'll see them appear here, and I might include some of them later in the conversation as well, but I'll get to ask questions first, which I'm very happy with. And my first question for you, and although we'll also be able to ask each other questions, is maybe a bit obvious, because I've been talking about this Evaluating the Evaluators project. I'm just curious how you feel about that, about Give a Weekend doing this project. So does anyone want to say anything about that?
I feel great about it, not just because you're asking me, Sjir.
It's a bit of putting you on the spot.
No, I think when you're coming to a charity rating, you kind of have to make some philosophical assumptions and some methodological assumptions in order to get to that rating, right? And I think right now it seems like it's a little bit difficult for donors to have the transparency to see what those assumptions are, to compare across different organizations. So I think it's going to be really good for those kind of transparency reasons. And also just to delve into methodological critique in a bit more depth.
Nice, yeah. You guys want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I am also very excited about it. Probably also a tiny bit nervous because now we get to experience what it's like from the other side. And I think that's going to be really valuable, both to just support the charities that we evaluate better. But in general, I just can't imagine we're not going to all learn from this and also identify what gaps there are in the evaluator space and maybe how we can align our work better. So yeah, I think it's very exciting.
Nice, yeah.
Ditto.
Ditto, nice. I frankly am also quite nervous about this thing, so, to be honest, but we'll see. I also wanted to ask you, you've just heard everyone speak. Do you have questions for each other that came up, things that stood out in each other's presentations that you want to ask each other after seeing this?
Yeah, I actually had one for Stien surrounding how you prioritize between if you have funds to allocate, how you decide whether to allocate it to a movement building grant versus a more direct impact grant or charity.
Yeah, so the movement grants are really going to organizations or projects or even individuals for which there is still very little data. We only evaluate charities that have a long history, that have things that we can actually look at and quantify, or and for some projects, they're just incredibly novel, or shrimp, there's just very little done for them in the last few years, so they don't have as much data yet, so we can't really evaluate or compare their work to what is being done for chickens, for instance.
So do you have a separate movement building budget then?
Yes, yeah. That's about, let's say our goal is to raise about 800K for that this year, and then for our grant-making fund that goes to our top and standout charities, that for them we have a budget of around a little over $1 million. So in total, we only directly distribute around $2 million. Yeah. Can I ask you a question, Rosie?
Yeah, sure, of course.
So you are into a lot of different cause areas. Does that mean that your founders also are interested in all of those areas? Is it spread evenly, or do they, you already said that they also give elsewhere. How does that spread out, do you know?
Yeah, sure. So our founders tend to have a mix of different interests. In our initial advisory call with them, we start to piece out what that is. And it is a mix. Some people come in and, long-termism is their thing. They want to find the best AI safety recommendations, and that's that. Some people come in and are, strongly climate. But there's some variation. There are some people who are a little bit more open. I would say we've had the most ease in getting global health and development funding, probably. And there's also a big chunk of people interested in climate. So that tends to be the interest that's most common in our founders. We have some who are interested in animal welfare, but perhaps unfortunately, it's been a relatively smaller slice of our members.
Nice, yeah. What are, because I think, Rosie, I think you put up some kind of misconceptions about that people might have about Founders Pledge. I'm curious whether you also have ideas what would be the most common misconceptions you encounter when talking about GiveWell and hey, some of you, Olivia, what about GiveWell? What do you think? What do you think is one of the biggest misconceptions people in this room might have about GiveWell?
Yeah, hopefully some of them are cleared up after my gorgeous presentation. But I think that one sense that I get sometimes surrounding EA is that people think of GiveWell as the baseline, the boring option, and they're going to go try to find something better and beat GiveWell in global health and development. And we're excited about people doing that, but also just want people to know that that's also GiveWell's goal. We have a dozen researchers or more working on trying to beat what GiveWell currently has as our recommendations and our funding opportunities.
That's exciting. I've encountered that a lot, to be honest. I've heard, often it's the boring one, the baseline, whereas actually you have a really high bar, as we've seen. You have a 10x Give Directly bar, which is just very hard to beat, I think. What about Ace?
I tried to go over some of the components of what is particular about animal charities, and I think those are probably leaning towards the most things that people are somewhat unaware of. And that also relates to why we can't be like GiveWell. We just have a lot less data. We also have a lot less money, so that means we can have fewer researchers. But we do have a very thorough process and very rigorous methods to evaluate and go through each of our criteria. And I told you about all the things that go into the approach. But to figure out which animals should receive priority, there's a whole weighted model underneath that too. It's probably a more complicated and thorough process than most people know, or even I understand because I've been 7 months in my role. So there's a lot I have to learn about that still too.
For Founders Pledge, I talked a little bit already, but an additional one that comes up is don't you guys just do climate? And our climate research is great, but we have other areas as well.
Great. One I often encounter, I think, or that we've also discussed previously, I think, is this difference between talking about charity recommendations and funding opportunities. Maybe any of you want to jump in on that difference?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So GiveWell has charity recommendations, but in the last 8 years, maybe a little bit fewer. Anyway, we've moved much more toward thinking about particular funding opportunities because there are different cost effectiveness of distributing malaria nets, for example, in a high burden area versus a low burden area. We need to be able to talk to the charities and evaluate each location they're considering expanding into as its own thing because there are separate factors that input into the cost effectiveness for each of those potential expansion areas. So when we talk about prioritizing funding opportunities over evaluating charities. It's much more about, this charity has some opportunities that are above 10x and some opportunities that are below 10x, and trying to distinguish between those so that we can fund the ones that are more cost effective than the others.
Nice. How does they think about this?
This might not exactly answer your question, but I think one of the things that is also somewhat a misconception sometimes about the work of ACE is that we recommend what the best charity is. It's not really what we do. We look at what the most effective charities are, and then which are the best use of your donations. Yeah, I think that relates a little bit, at least, to your question.
So that's also looking at, do they actually need extra money?
Exactly,
right? Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
Does Founders Pledge have a similar view or a distinct one on this, on the funding opportunity and charity one? Do you generally recommend charities, or do you recommend funding opportunities? How would you say?
So we recommend, like, our funds are generally our top recommendation. We also recommend the charities that we directly recommend, but sometimes we'll find a particular funding opportunity that we think is a good match for, like, a particular donor, and then we might link them up a little bit in that way. And we work with other organizations like GiveWell to do this sometimes. So there is some there could probably be more, but there's already, like, some crosstalk between organizations when we find, say, a really good funding opportunity, but for whatever reason we're struggling to find funding. There's some coordination behind the scenes.
And I think that relates to something that I think we were planning to talk about surrounding collaboration opportunities and the ways in which all of us, work with donors and have our particular area where we have funding opportunities and charities available. And I think that one way that we, as charity evaluators and in the broader charity evaluator space, can collaborate better is to, say, when GiveWell finds a donor who's interested in both global health and development and animals, to be able to, connect them to ACE instead of, have that back and forth.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point about the collaboration, that now that our whole movement is maturing more, I think that is a great opportunity to both align our work, learn from each other, and potentially, if there's more evaluators or funds that also somewhat evaluate, that we can potentially share data and information between each other so that we have more verification opportunities of what we do.
Cool.
Yeah, I think that Rosie, we recently, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say that. But
Tell me later.
There are research opportunities where we have talked to Founders Pledge and been excited to learn from them.
That's super exciting to see. Well, maybe we'll hear more about this next year.
It's not that exciting.
It's super exciting, I can tell. So we got some questions from you guys. Thank you so much for putting them in Swapcard. And I think the one that's upvoted most, which I also love to hear more about, is how you all look at approaches to evaluating policy initiatives. So as opposed to kind of the more direct, maybe like randomized controlled trialable interventions, and then how do you determine what the precise contribution of an organization is to a cause, like the additionality they add? So can you say a bit more about, about the methodology of how you think about policy evaluations for each of your organizations?
Do you think this means policy as in, like, legislation or our internal policies?
I think they talk about legislation, yeah.
Well, for those of you who are interested in animal welfare and policy, I'll later be moderating a conversation about comparing political advocacy versus corporate campaigns. So that's where that question will probably be answered better than what I will have to say. But like I said earlier, too, a lot of, when it comes to animal welfare, different types of approaches support each other. So yeah, I'll leave it to you to answer this question.
Yeah, similar. We've had a few evaluations where we've been thinking about policy. LEAP, for example, LEAP's one of our recommended charities. A recent one is about salt reduction policy. The way that we do this at the moment is we're still doing effectively a kind of cost effectiveness analysis. We're looking at, like, key characteristics that seem most important. This is inherently really difficult to do, but we try and get a sense of, that organization's history, their likelihood of success. We might talk to other experts to get a sense of that. Then we're going to look at the expected, value if they do have success. So what is the thing that they're trying to flip in policy? What will the impact of that be? And then we're going to compare those kind of key metrics across different organizations doing the same thing, and perhaps across different countries if that organization, likely is working in multiple different countries.
Yeah, it definitely, just to echo that it is challenging, and one aspect that makes it challenging is that somewhat likelihood of success and the organization's counterfactual impact go in different directions from one another. If, for example, there's a country that's really excited to enact a particular policy, then that might be really great for the organization thinking about their likelihood of success, but it might be not great for us trying to estimate how key that organization's input and work might be toward that success happening. So you kind of have to balance those, and echoing what Rosie said, checking on track record, looking at case studies, and talking to the actors that they're working with in the governments to see what value they've had so far from the organization we might support, and how excited they are to work with them in the future. But it's challenging.
It is. I got a really good question here, which I really like. Because we're talking a lot about evaluating charities, right? And Paul's talked about evaluating evaluators, but that won't be about evaluating you as funding opportunities or as like your own success, but about the methodology you use to make recommendations. But there's a question here, which is, what metrics, if any, do you use to evaluate your own success as a charity? How do you measure your own success? Can you say a bit about that?
I'm really curious about how you are going to do that.
Oh, but so there's, I think, an interesting difference. So the way we're going to do these evaluating the evaluators thing is we're going to look at, the question is, which evaluators should we use the recommendations from? So which use the best methodology to come to high impact recommendations? But that's something different from asking, are you as a charity having an impact? Mm-hmm. So we're not evaluating your impact, we're evaluating your recommendations process. And so I'm curious how you think about evaluating your own impact as an organization, currently, how you go about that and how you plan to go about that in the future.
Yeah, we measure it in several different ways. I think the whole impact analytics field is actually super interesting, and you can really delve into it. Some key ways, like the simpler sort of imperfect ways, are things like tracking our pledge value and tracking our money moved to our recommended funding opportunities. But something that we're really trying to get at here is the counterfactuality. So if one of our members gives, say, a donation to a high impact funding opportunity, but perhaps they're already very versed in effective giving, and we think that even without our existence, they would have given that money to an equally effective organization anyway, then the counterfactual value of that is less. And if we have evidence of that, we discount it. But there's no denying that assessing that counterfactuality, I think, is a real challenge for the field. And I think something that's really important is getting those people who are not really already effective givers, yet they're interested in it enough that you can effectively steer them. So I'd be really interested to hear how you guys think about that.
We focus a lot on, on the fundraising side, how much money we move, and then we think a lot on the research side about what sorts of gaps we're finding at what cost effectiveness. We don't tackle as much of the question of counterfactual. We have tried in the past, but it's just pretty challenging to, we have a survey that we send out where we ask people how much would you have given without GiveWell, and what other factors would you consider? But when you have as many donors as we do, it's just challenging to turn that into anything that we could really action.
I'll keep it short because I saw a sign that we are running out of time, but I wish Elizabeth Ormandy was here. She's our research director, and she's actually now starting the process of really figuring out how we can figuring out how we can determine the assumptions that we're making in our theory of change, because so much of it is based on how we can support the animal advocacy movement. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to seeing where that is going, and you should be able to see that in this coming year on the forum probably, but yeah, no quick answer here for you.
Exciting, thank you. Thanks everyone for the great questions. We're running out of time indeed, so before we do, I will show you this last slide. Yeah, oh there it is, ooh, yeah. What can you do, right? Because that's important. So we're all sitting here. Hopefully the session was useful for you, but hopefully there's also some things you can do. We're all, to some extent, hiring or looking for people to join our teams in the future. So please, if you're interested in working in this field, go to our websites or come talk to us. That's one big thing to shout out. But of course, one big reason why we're sitting here is to get more money to very highly effective charities to help their beneficiaries. So if this is something you'd like to do, we definitely encourage you to do that yourself, give effectively, and inspire others to do so as well, and talk to others about all the research you've learned about. If you want to learn more about all of this, please come to our websites, come to our office hours, which are right here, right after the session. We'll stay here, we'll be hanging around here, so you can ask questions immediately, and you can also reach out to us via Swapcard and learn more in that way. With that said, I just want to a big thanks to all of you. I've just been really nice to share the stage with you and learn a bit more myself about what you're doing. And thanks to you for all your questions. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.